I never collected dolls, and I never felt sentimental about objects left near the dumpster behind my apartment. Yet, on a windless evening at the start of winter, I paused beside the cracked lid and noticed a porcelain doll balanced as if someone had set it there with care, its pale face mapped with hairline fractures, its blue-painted eyes as flat as puddles in weak light, its cotton dress stiff with grime and a faint scent that reminded me of basements and old paper. And I turned away because I told myself it was only trash and I had no space for other people's stories. Then I carried my bag upstairs to the second floor and locked the door and tried to focus on my small dinner and a streaming show and the quiet routine I kept to keep my mind clear. And in the morning when I opened the door to fetch coffee from the corner place, I saw the same doll standing upright on my mat with its head angled toward the knob as if it had waited for the first click. And I felt a slow lift of cold under my ribs while my eyes tried to make sense of the chipped lashes and the single smear of dark dust on its cheek that looked like a fingerprint, and I could not accept that it had moved on its own, so I carried it back down the stairs and set it by the dumpster again, and told myself some neighbor had thought it amusing to bring the ugly thing to my door. And I went about the day, and that night after work, I took it further, past the alley and across the street to the municipal bin near the little park where the swings clinked in winter wind. And I placed the doll inside with care because I did not like the thought of it falling and shattering and drawing attention. And I went back to my ordinary evening and tried to push it out of my head while my building settled and the radiator hissed and the television filled the room with voices that did not belong to anyone I knew. Yet, when dawn spread a thin gray over the blinds and I pulled the door open to breathe cold air, found the doll again, this time leaning against the frame as if it had grown tired on the way and needed to rest. And I told myself there had to be a reasonable sequence of events behind it, and it would reveal itself if I kept track. So I picked it up with a dish towel and set it on the kitchen counter and studied it for details while the coffee maker chugged and the window glass fogged, and I noticed the back of the head was unglazed and rough to the touch, and stamped with a faint emblem that looked like a crown above a number, and there was a line of thread along the neck where the porcelain met a cloth body, and when I pressed the torso, it gave like a beanbag filled with sand, and within the ruffles I found a tiny pin shaped like a bird, and all of it felt like any other cheap antique, though my apartment seemed to strain against the presence on the counter like a room that disliked a new piece of furniture, and I wrapped the doll and placed it inside a grocery bag and sealed the top with tape and drove it in my aging sedan to a donation bin near a church 3 neighborhoods away, and pushed it through the metal flap and stood there longer than necessary as the cold tugged at my ears, and I went home with a deliberate sense of order restored. And I slept with the bedroom door closed because the building creaked while the temperature dropped and the sounds bothered me when I let them. And sometime before dawn, I woke from a dream where the apartment hallway extended without end, and the dim carpet pattern kept repeating. And I listened, not fully awake, until I registered a faint tapping that rose and fell like someone testing a metronome. And I lay still and told myself the radiator could make a noise like that, and I waited for it to resolve. And when the alarm on my phone buzzed, I went to the front door and opened it and saw the grocery bag on the mat with the tape unsealed and the doll upright inside, its head tilted as if its ear attended to the seam in the door. And the space between my shoulder blades tightened while my mind tried to recall whether I might have left another bag on the counter. But I had not, and after a long, slow breath, I brought the bag back inside and set it down, and felt the thin weight of ridicule from an unseen place like the smirk of a stranger when you trip on a curb. And I carried the doll to the car again during lunch and drove farther to a county dump. And I paid the small fee and tossed the wrapped package into a mound where machines pushed refuse into orderly hills, and I watched it disappear, and I drove back under a low sky, and I felt tired in a way that did not match the hour, and that night the tapping returned, and it moved. Not constant this time, but in short stretches like footsteps measured by a child who tried to be careful on a wooden floor, and I sat up and said under my breath that there was no one in the apartment, and there were no children on my lease, and there was nothing to fear. And even though my words had no volume, they echoed against my teeth. And the next morning, The doll waited on the mat again with a faint new crack across the forehead like a tiny river delta that had not been there before. And along the rim of the crack I saw a residue that looked like ash, and when I touched it with one finger it smudged like very fine soot. And I waded through a workday that dragged like wet fabric, and I ordered a small camera and mounted it above the door and connected it to my phone because I wanted proof that someone had been playing a long joke. And that night I checked the feed every hour, and then I fell into a shallow sleep with the phone in my hand. And near dawn I jolted awake from the bright flare of the screen, and I saw a series of timestamps and motion alerts, and I scrubbed backward and watched the door in the grainy black image, and there was only the hallway and the mottled paint and the mat, and a moment where the picture hummed and blurred and then cleared, and after the blur the doll stood on the mat as if it had always been there, and there was no body moving in the frame and no gloved hand sliding into view and no reflection in the brass, and my mind grabbed for an explanation, maybe a hardware glitch or a neighbor who knew the blind spot of the lens, and I measured angles and drifted through online forums and read about packet loss and infrared bounce-off glossy surfaces and the way timestamps drifted when the firmware faltered, and none of it fit the simple fact that the doll appeared when the picture did not register anything else, and I accepted that the camera would not solve this because the problem did not want to be filmed, and the day stretched and the air felt stale as if the apartment forgot to cycle. And that evening I took the doll to the roof and set it near the low parapet where a vent warmed the tiles, and I watched the city for a while and tried to feel separate from the small figure at my feet, and then I picked it up and carried it to the stairwell, and instead of my apartment, I climbed down to the basement because the building offered a storage cage with a padlock where the previous tenant had left paint cans and a broken chair, and I set the doll inside on a crate and closed the door and locked it and turned off the light and took the stairs 2 at a time to put distance between me and any impulse to look back, and I slept shallow again and woke to the usual creak and to a new sound like tiny nails dragging across wood. And when I opened the door in the morning, the doll waited on the mat with a line of dust along its dress hem, and I swallowed a rush of dry air and called the leasing office and asked for pest control because that sounded like a normal request. And a contractor came 2 days later and set traps behind the stove and in the hall. And during those 2 days, the doll returned each morning after I disposed of it each evening, and the tapping made the traps rattle, though nothing took the bait. And I thought about telling the contractor to look for intruders that were not insects, and I kept that thought in my head like a thin, poisonous seed I refused to plant. And that Friday, I drove to the town where I grew up because I still had a storage unit behind a low strip of shops with a barber and a nail salon and a discount bookstore, and I thought I could bury the doll under boxes and leave it there like a bad note in a file. And I put it in a plastic tub with a lid, and I pushed the tub behind 2 crates of books and an old television, and I went to my parents' grave because it was nearby. And I fed the silence with the details of the week without saying their names because that still bothered me years later. And I went back to the city after dark, and I slept for a few hours. And I woke to the slap of mail on the floor because the carrier liked to push envelopes fully through, and the doll lay beside the mail with a new bend to the neck and a shimmer on the eye like moisture. And I did not accept what I saw, and I did not reject it either. I did the thing people do when their world refuses their terms. I kept moving through tasks while my thoughts circled the perimeter of a fence they could not climb. And by midweek I was looking up the emblem stamped on the head, and I learned about a small maker in a former mill town that had turned out decorative dolls through the middle of the last century, and I read a digitized brochure and a local history blog that mentioned a fire that had taken the factory one winter when a space heater blew, and I found a photograph that showed a line of girls who had worked there painting eyes in assembly as if that belonged to their childhood. And there was a caption that listed first names and the word lost beside 3 of them, and I looked at the faces and tried to project destiny and fear and hope onto the grain, and I knew that I was not equipped to correct the past, and that my interest could not change the present. And I closed the laptop and sat on the floor beside the door, because I had grown used to that place, as if proximity to the threshold might grant me leverage over what crossed it. And sleep crept up while I watched the mat. And when I woke, my head felt packed with sand, and the doll stood an inch from the line where the door swung. And a pale smear on the wood marked how far it had leaned against the frame while I slept, And I understood that this was no prank, because a prank required an audience and a punchline, and I was not being teased, I was being shaped. And once that idea entered me, it did not leave, and I felt my habits fray in small ways, and I forgot to reply to emails, and I left a burner on for a time, and I took the stairs because the elevator felt like a metal box that might keep me too still and too close to a reflection I no longer trusted. And I began to notice the doll's influence in places that did not make sense. Like my phone screen sometimes showed a filter overlay that softened edges and washed colors in a pale tone like old photographs. And my building's shared laundry room felt charged as if static waited for salt in the air. And I found one sock with a line of soot across the toe, and the air smelled like damp ash when no one had used the machines. And I carried the doll to a thrift store with a friendly volunteer at a desk, and I placed it on the counter with other items, and I filled out a quick form with a printed name and a date. And I stepped to the door and saw the volunteer turn to greet someone. And I watched a cart roll past with a squeak, and I looked back, and the doll no longer sat on the counter, and the volunteer did not react to what should have been a breakable object falling. And I left and assumed it would end there, because a cart of donations filled with unpredictable things might swallow it. And when I reached my building, a small package leaned against my door, and the labored handwriting declared my unit and the return address of the thrift store. And inside the box, nestled in tissue paper, I found the doll looking clean, as if someone had wiped dust from its face with a damp cloth and polished the glass eyes with care. And there was a thank you card that said the item had been identified as a special donation for a partner museum and needed my signature for transfer. And I noticed the pen stroke lines that did not belong to any person I knew, and I did not call because a voice would put me in a shape I could not hold. And I signed and left the paper on the lobby table, and the next morning the paper was gone, and the doll remained with me. And I tried a fire because every story in every part of the country offered that as a solution for things that latched on. So I drove to a lake where the picnic grills sat empty, and the wind moved in steady waves through brown reeds, and I waited until no one stood on the path. And I lit charcoal and fed pieces of pallet wood until the coals glowed, and I lowered the doll into the basin and turned away because the heat reached at my face, and the fire burned through cloth and rasped along porcelain, and the smell carried the memory of old varnish and glue, and the surface darkened and blistered, and I watched the edges of the dress flare and collapse, and a line of black spread across the forehead. And when only fragments remained, I waited until the metal cooled, and I collected the shards in a paper bag and drove to a different town and found a public trash can with a heavy lid and let the pieces fall into the empty clatter at the bottom, and I did not look for reassurance. And I came home, and I slept with a kind of weight that felt like surrender, and the morning light found me slower than usual, and at the door the mat held a pattern I had not noticed, a faint circular scuff that gleamed like something had turned in place, and on the counter, in the kitchen, I found a single shard of porcelain shaped like a crescent, and the edge shone as if freshly broken. And when I touched it, I felt a mild electric pulse in my fingertip, and I set it on a saucer and watched it while coffee brewed. And I felt like someone who waited for a phone to ring, and nothing rang, and the day moved across me without friction. And that night, as the city went quiet, I heard a new sound, like a short sigh from inside the walls, followed by a hush that felt intentional. And I turned every light on and sat in the chair by the door again and told myself that a person could outwait a thing if the person chose patience. And in the early hours, the doorknob moved a fraction with a soft scrape, and I heard tiny taps in the hallway like heels set down with patience, and the door did not open because the lock held. And at sunrise, the doll stood there again, whole and unburned, with only a faint marred texture where the soot had been, and the crack that had crossed the forehead looked healed, yet not healed like skin over a wound that closed without a scar. And I felt the kind of thick reluctance that comes before a confession. And I accepted that the doll did not want to be disposed of, and did not want to be cleansed, and did not want to be owned either. It wanted to be attended to without remedy. And that recognition changed how I moved in the apartment, because I no longer avoided it as an object, and I no longer fought it as a threat. I acknowledged it like a relative whose presence complicated the room, and in that shift, the tapping lessened. And for 2 nights, the sounds thinned until I slept through a full stretch for the first time in days. And then a new phase began where the doll did not wait at the door each morning, because it went elsewhere. And I noticed it in photographs that I did not remember taking. A blurred white along the margin of a picture of my hallway. A shadow under a table leg in a shot of my kitchen. Reflection in a window that showed a tiny pale oval where no face should have been. And my phone gallery felt like a trail of sightings left by hands that were not mine. And I decided to approach the building manager because there had to be a record of a previous tenant who collected dolls or stored them in the basement. And the manager told me the lease history showed a woman who had passed 6 years before I moved in and who had worked at an antiques booth at a flea market near the river. And the manager offered a few loose facts about the woman's tendency to fill the unit with boxes and the odd smell in the hallway when she heated glue for repairs. And I thanked the manager and checked the flea market schedule and drove there on a Sunday morning when the sun made the asphalt shine like a pond. And I walked between tables of knickknacks and boxes of kitchenware and racks of old clothes. And I found an older man who remembered the woman and pointed toward a corner where the cheap jewelry now sat. And he said the booth had once been a sort of shelter for broken toys, and he told me the booth had closed after a winter storm when pipes burst and soaked the inventory, and the woman died from a fall on the ice outside a diner that week. And he shrugged like he had taken care not to dwell, and I bought a cheap compass from him because I felt like I needed an object to mark the conversation. And I returned to the apartment with the unhelpful knowledge that the doll had belonged to a person who once tended broken things, and I sat with that for a while, and tried to see each small move in my place through the lens of maintenance rather than malice. And for a few days it helped because the houseplants perked up and the drip under the sink stopped as if someone had tightened a ring with small, precise hands. And then the doll resumed its morning posture at the door and leaned its head against the wood so light that the grain made a faint print on its cheek, like a memory of bark. And I began to speak in my head to it because words needed a root and a shape, and I did not want to push air through the room, and I told it that I saw it, and that I understood it had a claim that did not align with ownership, and that I would not try to erase it. And that night I slept in the bedroom with the door open because there was nothing to hide. And I woke during the dark stretch that comes before the first bus, and the room felt lit from below as if a soft lamp hummed under the bed, and I listened for the taps and found none. And I sat up and felt the mattress release my weight like a slow breath. And I realized the light was not a light, but a sense that the air had brightness without source. And my eyes adjusted and I saw a faint shape at the threshold, not the doll itself, but the idea of it. A small silhouette cut from a darker fabric than the rest of the dark, and it seemed to wait with the patience of a rule that no one could break, and I lay back and watched it until the room faded into gray. And in the morning nothing stood at the door, and the mat looked normal and the walls felt ordinary. And the doll sat at the kitchen table with its legs dangling like a child in a chair that was too high. And that was new because the doll had never left the mat in the light, and the sight formed a still point in my chest, like a nail driven deep into wood, and I carried it to the counter and placed it there, and washed my hands and made toast and ate, while a quiet hum filled the air like electricity running through cable outside. And I thought about the quiet rules of attention, how a thing changes when watched with steady regard. And I kept my gaze on the doll for a long time, and the hand on the left seemed to change its angle by a small degree. And I told myself that small movements could be tricks of expectation, and yet the thumb lay pressed against the palm when once it had flared slightly, and the truth did not care if I accepted it. And that afternoon I drove to a library across town because a grant had digitized local papers, and I wanted to check the week of the factory fire. And I printed a story that mentioned a girl who had been learning to paint irises on porcelain blanks and who had stopped to eat a sandwich in a back room when a heater overheated. And the article used the neutral language of bad news and did not name the girl because consent belonged to the deceased differently then, and I folded the paper and placed it in the glove box like a map I did not plan to follow. And I went home and set the doll on the sill where the light could find it, and the days went quiet. And in the quiet I felt the shape of a pact, not written and not spoken, but real in the way a rut in a road is real. And that shape kept me within a new routine. And when friends asked about plans, I delayed without making excuses because I did not want anyone in the space, and the world beyond my building felt like a show I had already watched, and one night a storm blew heavy rain against the windows and backed up the street gutters until water rose over the curb, and power flickered and came back, and a smell rolled through the apartment like a mixture of wet wool and smokehouse, and I stood in the hallway, and the door to the storage cage below creaked though wind could not reach it, and I realized the doll had been coming from below more often than I understood. And in that knowledge my nerves found a new tension that felt like the tightness before a wire snaps. And I went down the stairs with a flashlight and stood before the storage door and heard something small shift on the other side. And I unlocked it, and the light showed the crate where I had once set the doll, and the paint cans, and the broken chair. And beside the crate lay a ring of tiny ash prints, no larger than bottle caps, moving in a line toward the back wall, where a faint opening showed under a pipe, and I crouched and put the light close and saw the opening led to a cavity that ran behind the walls and up, and the ash prints went both ways, and I thought about the tapping, and I imagined a route that let something move without weather and without notice. And when I returned to my unit, the doll waited again, and I felt no surprise, only the steady presence of a schedule that did not need my participation. And I told myself that I could live with this like any long-term condition if I respected its border. And the weeks shifted towards spring, and the city woke earlier, and my body remembered what it meant to step outside without bracing against wind. And for a time, the doll kept to the mornings, and I kept to my days, and I worked, and I slept, and I watered plants and watched their leaves tilt toward light. And then the boundary faltered because one evening I came home from a late meeting and found my door ajar by an inch. And I knew I had locked it because my hands knew the rhythm of the bolt, and nothing inside looked disturbed, and the windows were still closed, and the closet doors stood where I had left them. And only the smell had changed, as if a room in a museum had opened once and shut again, and the doll sat on my pillow with a strand of my hair caught in the seam of its neck. And in that moment, the arrangement we had held secret between us tore, and I felt anger like heat in my teeth, and I wanted to crush the doll in my hands and feel the brittle shell give. And I lifted it and felt the weight of sand inside and the texture of glaze against my palms. And I carried it to the sink and turned on the disposal and pressed the body against the rim, and the sound swallowed the kitchen with a metal growl that vibrated in my arms, and I pushed, and the doll seemed to grow heavier, and my grip slipped, and the disposal choked and stopped, and the breakers tripped, and silence pressed on the tile, and I stood in the dark kitchen with the doll cradled like a small body. And I understood that raw force would not undo this, because the thing that moved through the doll did not live in it the way a kernel lives in a shell. It used it as a door, and doors did not die when you dented them. They simply refused visitors. And I put it down gently like a truce flag, and I reset the breaker, and the lights returned, and the doll seemed unchanged except for a fine new scratch on the back of the head. And I took a long shower with water as hot as the heater allowed, and I stood under it until the mirror fogged and the room smelled like clean soap, and the sound hid any smaller sounds that wanted to reach me, and I slept and did not dream. And the next morning I found the doll on the mat again, and behind it on the hallway carpet, tiny lines of soot formed a pattern, like a compass rose with lines pointing toward my door and outward toward other units, and I brushed the pattern with my foot, and it smeared into a smudge like a map burned by a careless match. And I knocked on a neighbor's door and asked if anyone had been leaving odd items in the hall, and the neighbor said the halls were clear when she took her dog out during the early hours, and I looked at the dog and saw its hairs lift as it sniffed near the doll, though it did not bark. And I thanked her and went back inside, and I felt the weight of a decision that had been waiting for me. And I knew I would need to leave the apartment because the relationship had fused with the place, and I needed to cut the bond. And I found a listing for a sublet near the river with a month-to-month option, and a view of a bridge where trains crossed at night. And I signed the papers and packed without telling anyone why. And on the last day, I left keys with the manager and wheeled 2 suitcases to the new place. And I decided not to take the doll, and I did not try to trap it. I left it on the kitchen table in the old unit, with a glass of water beside it like a gesture of decency, and I walked down the stairs without looking up at the camera that still watched the hallway, and the sky felt new though the air tasted the same, and the new apartment smelled like paint and dust, and the first night passed without tapping, and I slept a full cycle and woke with the kind of alertness I had not felt in months. And when I opened the door to fetch coffee, there was no doll on the mat, and I went to the cafe and drank slowly and watched people and felt part of the surface of the world again. And I stayed out through the afternoon and walked the river path and listened to the soft clack of bicycle wheels and the low wash of water against pilings. And when I returned near dark, the doll stood at the center of the new living room floor with a smear of soot under one foot and no other sign of dirt, and the bridge lights reflected in its glass eyes like tiny moons. And I set down my bag and spoke only in my head because I had learned that sound did not matter to it, and I said I would not run again, and I would not try to break it, and I would not deliver it to anyone else to carry. And in that settlement something changed in the room. A pressure uncoiled and the air felt lighter, though the situation did not become less dangerous. And over the next weeks, the doll took up a schedule that I could track, appearing near doors and windows during mornings, near the bedroom at twilight, near the kitchen sink during storms, and on the nights when the moon rose huge and pale, it positioned itself near the balcony slider with its head turned toward the glow as if a person missed a long walk. And my life slid into a new stability built on observation and the careful maintenance of a ritual colored by respect. And I watched my words with friends and kept my tone even and non-committal. And some part of me understood that the doll's power fed on a tension that curdled into fear, and my restraint limited it, and yet nothing about restraint prevented the final turn, because one night in late summer when heat lingered in concrete and the city glimmered with a haze, I woke from regular sleep and felt weight on my chest the way a cat sits when it wants to be fed. And in the dimness I saw the round, pale face close to my chin and the painted eyes level with mine. And I felt as if my heartbeat had moved into a smaller body and then returned with a new rhythm. And I could not move and did not try because every choice carried a price. And the temperature of the room dropped as if a cold front pushed through only my apartment. And the doll's face did not change, but its presence expanded like cold water poured into warm oil. And then the weight lifted and the room warmed. And when I sat up, the doll lay beside me with its head tilted toward the pillow, and a faint ring of ash encircled it on the sheet. And the ring looked unbroken until I reached a finger to test it, and the ash smeared in one place as if it had been made for show and not for containment. And over the following days, I felt different in ways that did not alarm anyone else because the differences were small and private. A hand that lingered too long on a cold pane, a glance that returned to mirrors and held, a preference for taking the long way home past the playground with a small merry-go-round that creaked in wind. And I knew that the doll had found a path through me and that it no longer needed the door to make itself known. And the knowledge settled not like dread, but like a rule. And I lived under it with a strange calm that shared a border with resignation, and I kept living because the day expects you to keep living. And I kept the apartment clean and the counters clear and the kinds of things that attract dust sealed. And when new neighbors moved into the unit next door, I offered them a spare parking pass and kept my voice even and pleasant. And I watched their child leave tiny chalk lines on the sidewalk, and I felt a tug that had no direction. And back in my living room, the doll waited most mornings by the slider. And on days when the wind shifted off the river, the smell of damp ash returned and then faded. And today, as I record this from my desk at the far wall with the blinds tilted to let in a band of sky, the doll stands at the edge of my vision near the door where deliveries arrive and where people knock when they have the wrong unit. And I can write this calmly because calm is the armor I built in a season when every day began with a new test. And the truth is simple, and I understand it without drama. I threw the doll away and it returned. I broke it and it returned. I moved homes and it returned. And now it no longer needs to return because it never leaves. It waits as the day moves and as my attention goes elsewhere and comes back. And it guides my hours with light pressure the way a teacher guides a child's hand to trace letters. And when I place a glass too close to the counter edge, I slide it back without thought. And when a stove burner clicks more than it should, I turn it off and wait and then try again. And when the balcony door catches on a flaw in the track, I lift and ease it, because I do not want to wake anything in the rails. And my life continues inside this narrow grant of peace. And if you hear steps that are not steps outside your door and a light tapping while you count the slow breaths before dawn, know that there is a way through that does not end in fire or flight. It ends in an arrangement with a presence that wants attention rather than departure. And each morning it may stand at your door as it stood at mine. And if it does, you will understand how thin your skin is between the world you name and the world that names you back.